The cursed tombstone. The cemetery was cold that night, colder than it had any right to be for October. The wind howled through the trees, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching into the sky, grasping for something they could never quite catch. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the scent of damp earth heavy in the air as I made my way through the rows of graves. Halloween in a cemetery seemed fitting, a tradition even. And I was here again, as I had been every year since I could remember. Only this time something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pressed on, my breath a thick cloud in the cold air, and my heart began to beat just a little faster. It wasn't fear, not yet, but something was gnawing at me from the inside, something that told me I shouldn't have come alone this time. I brushed the thought away. It was just a cemetery, for God's sake. Just stones, bones, and old stories. That's when I saw it. The tombstone was cracked, jagged like something had clawed its way through the marble. It sat at a crooked angle, half sunk into the earth, as if the ground itself was trying to swallow it whole. I squinted, stepping closer, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, and then my heart stopped. My name, my exact name, was etched into the stone. No, not just my name. The birth date, too. The cold bite of the air turned to ice in my veins as I stared down at it, a chill crawling up my spine. The stone had been here a long time. Moss and dirt clung to its surface like a second skin. Yet there was no mistaking the inscription, no denying the sickening truth of it. My throat was tight and the world around me seemed to slow. This couldn't be real. The cemetery was silent, too silent. As if everything had gone still, holding its breath along with me. Then, faint at first, there came the sound of whispers. They seemed to come from all around me, slipping through the cracks of the night, barely audible over the rustling leaves, yet unmistakable. I turned, but there was nothing. No one. Just the stones and shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they had any right to. That's when I saw it. Movement, out of the corner of my eye, flickering between the trees. A figure pale and distant just at the edge of the cemetery. My heart kicked into overdrive. I wasn't alone. I blinked, trying to focus on the figure, but it was gone, like smoke in the wind. My eyes darted from stone to stone, tree to tree, searching for some rational explanation. But instead I found something worse. A hand, skeletal and cold, shot out from the ground near the cursed tombstone. The fingers, long and bony, clawed at the earth as if trying to drag itself free. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, my mind racing. A shadow moved again, closer this time. And then I heard it, a low, guttural voice, deep and distorted, coming from beneath the ground. "Grace," I froze. The voice seemed to crawl up from the earth itself, soaked in malice and ancient, forgotten rage. My legs felt like lead, but somehow I found the strength to turn and run. The sound of dirt shifting, of something moving under the ground, echoed behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like a chorus of lost souls all begging to be heard. My feet pounded against the earth, breath tearing through my lungs until I reached the iron gate at the entrance of the cemetery. And then everything stopped. The night went still again, as if the world itself had paused. I looked back, but the figure, the hand, the cursed tombstone, they were all gone. The cemetery stood as it always had, quiet, desolate, as though nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. A sharp, cold gust of wind whipped through the gate, and as it passed, I heard the voice again, this time a whisper in my ear, so close I could feel its breath. "You can't run forever, Grace." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the broken tombstone staring back at me from the shadows. The name still etched deep into its surface, my name. And the crack had spread. The Cursed Tombstone, Part 2. The nightmares began that night. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air as if something had wrapped its cold fingers around my throat. In the dream, I had been standing in front of that tombstone again. The earth beneath it was shifting, cracking open, something dark and vile reaching up toward me from the depths. But it wasn't just a dream. I could still hear the voice, that guttural growl echoing in my skull, repeating my name over and over again. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat up in bed, heart racing, staring at the slivers of moonlight that crept through my window blinds. Every little noise, every creak of the house settling made me jump. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. Nothing more. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it, the image of that broken tombstone kept clawing its way back to the front of my mind. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves stretched thin. But the world outside was bright, normal. People were walking their dogs, kids riding their bikes down the street. The cemetery felt like a distant memory, something that should have been easy to forget. Should have been. I needed to go back. I didn't want to. The very thought of it made my stomach churn, but there was this pull, this awful nagging feeling in the back of my head that wouldn't let me rest. Something was waiting for me there. Something I needed to see. I drove to the cemetery just before dusk, when the world was caught between light and dark. The golden glow of the sun was fading, casting long shadows across the rows of gravestones. I told myself I was just being ridiculous, that this was all some horrible coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. I parked outside the wrought iron gate, staring down the long path leading into the heart of the cemetery. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This was a mistake. But I got out of the car anyway. The air was colder than it had been the night before, biting at my skin. But I pushed forward, my breath puffing out in front of me in short, nervous bursts. The tombstone wasn't far. I knew exactly where it was, even though I had tried so hard to forget. When I reached it, my heart sank. The crack had spread. It wasn't just a jagged line anymore, it had split wide open, as if the earth itself had given up, ready to let something crawl out. My name was still etched there, mocking me, daring me to run. But this time there was something else. Words that hadn't been there before. Freshly carved into the stone, the letters sharp, clean. Death follows you. A shiver shot down my spine. I took a step back, my pulse quickening, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The whispers started again, soft at first, just like before. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. I turned, desperate to leave, but that's when I saw her. A figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, partially hidden behind one of the larger mausoleums. She was pale, too pale, her skin almost translucent under the fading light. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared straight at me. She didn't move, didn't speak, but there was something familiar about her, something I couldn't place. I took a step toward her and she vanished. Just like that, gone as if she had never been there at all. My chest tightened, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I wasn't imagining this. Something was very wrong and I needed to get out. Now. I turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven ground as the whispers chased me, louder and louder, until they weren't whispers anymore but screams, howling, violent screams that tore through the night. I could hear something moving behind me, the crunch of footsteps on dead leaves. I didn't dare look back. As I reached the gate, I slammed into something solid. A figure. No, her. The woman was right in front of me, her face inches from mine, her eyes wide and empty, lips twisted into a grotesque grin that stretched too far across her face. Her skin was peeling, flesh rotting away, exposing the bone underneath. And then, without warning, she opened her mouth, and from it poured a sound so guttural, so unnatural, it made my bones vibrate. "Grace!" I screamed. Everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground just outside the cemetery gate. My head was pounding, my vision blurry. The sky was pitch black now, and the cold had settled deep into my bones. My car was still parked where I had left it, but something was wrong. The windows, they were fogged up as though something had been breathing on the glass. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling, and hurried to the car. The whispers had stopped, the cemetery silent once more, but I could still feel her eyes on me, watching from the shadows. As I fumbled with the keys, I caught a glimpse of something written on the back window, scrawled in the condensation. "See you soon." I didn't wait. I threw myself into the car, slammed the door, and sped off into the night, not daring to look back at the cursed tombstone or the figure that had been haunting me. But even as I drove, my hands shaking on the wheel, the words burned into my mind. "See you soon." The worst part was I knew it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The Cursed Tombstone, Part 3. I didn't leave the house for days. Couldn't. The curtains stayed drawn, the doors locked, but it didn't help. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. That grotesque grin, those empty eyes, the sound of my name crawling out of her rotting throat like something alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, lurking just outside, beyond the safety of my locked doors and drawn blinds. Every noise made me jump, a creak of the floor, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the wind rustling outside the windows. I told myself it was nothing, just my nerves unraveling after what had happened at the cemetery, but it was getting worse. At night, I could hear the whispers again. Faint, at first, like someone speaking just beyond the threshold of my hearing, then louder, until they seemed to echo through every corner of the house. The voice was the same every time, deep, guttural, ancient. Grace, Grace, I knew what it wanted. The cemetery, the tombstone, her. But I couldn't go back. I wouldn't. On the fourth day, something changed. I was in the kitchen, staring blankly at the coffee I hadn't touched, when the temperature in the room dropped. Not just cold, but freezing. My breath hung in the air, and a familiar, sickening chill crept up my spine. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then they went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then the scratching began. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, more desperate, like nails raking against wood. My heart was in my throat, the sound vibrating through my bones. It was coming from the front door. I moved slowly, my breath shallow, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't leave. Not now. Not with whatever was outside waiting for me. The scratching grew more frantic, more insistent, as if something was clawing its way through the wood. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I took a step back, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. My eyes were locked on the front door, waiting for the next sound. But what came next wasn't a sound. It was a shadow. A figure standing just outside the window, its outline barely visible through the thin gap in the curtains. I could see the shape of it, tall, gaunt, motionless. Watching. My blood ran cold. It was her. For a long, terrible moment, neither of us moved. I was frozen, my feet glued to the floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. And then slowly, the figure outside the window began to move. Its hand, pale and bony, reached up and pressed against the glass. The fingers dragged down slowly, leaving smudges on the window like a trail of decay. I stumbled backward, knocking into the table, sending the coffee cup crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the empty house, and the figure outside stopped. The whisper started again. Grace, Grace. The air was thick with dread. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I had to run. But before I could move, there was a knock at the door. Soft. Polite, even. Like someone waiting to be invited in. My blood turned to ice. I backed away, heart racing, every inch of me screaming not to go near that door. But I couldn't stop myself. Something was pulling me forward, some unseen force drawing me toward the source of the knock. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. The cold metal sent a jolt up my arm, but I couldn't pull away. Slowly, I turned it, the creak of the hinges cutting through the silence like a scream. The door swung open. No one was there. The street outside was empty, the night still. But my skin prickled with the undeniable feeling that I was being watched, that someone, was right there, just out of sight. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I took a step back, ready to slam the door shut. And then I saw it. At my feet, resting on the threshold, was a single object. Small, unassuming, but enough to make my blood freeze in my veins. It was a photograph. I bent down slowly, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The edges were worn, the image faded, but there was no mistaking what it showed. The cemetery, that tombstone, and me standing in front of it. Only it wasn't the me of now. It was a younger version of me, a version I barely remembered. I couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, standing in the exact spot where I'd found the broken tombstone. But there was something else. Someone was standing behind me in the picture, barely visible, half shrouded in shadow. Her. My heart hammered in my chest, and the world seemed to spin. I dropped the photo, backing away, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Grace, Grace. The lights flickered back on, and for a moment I thought I was safe. But then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder, the grip icy and firm. I turned, slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and there she was. Standing inches from me, her face pale and twisted, her eyes hollow, her mouth curling into that same grotesque grin. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating, her eyes locked onto mine with a hunger that made my stomach turn. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. She leaned in closer, her breath cold against my skin. You're next. And then the lights went out again. Darkness swallowed the room. The cold, suffocating weight of it pressed in on me from all sides. And for a brief, terrifying moment, I was sure this was it. This was how it ended. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in place as she loomed over me, her breath chilling my skin, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. But something shifted inside me, some small, flickering light, a memory, faint but growing stronger. I remembered the photo, the one that showed me as a child in front of the tombstone. I wasn't alone in that memory. There had been someone with me, someone who had protected me before. My grandmother. She had always told me stories about the cemetery, about the spirits that wandered, lost, and trapped between worlds. But she had also spoken of peace, of how spirits were only bound by unfinished business, how sometimes they just needed someone to help them find their way back. A sudden warmth spread through my chest, cutting through the icy terror. My grandmother had taught me that fear wasn't always the answer, that sometimes the only way to defeat the darkness was to face it head-on. And I realized in that moment, staring into the hollow eyes of the figure before me, that I wasn't dealing with pure evil. I was dealing with a soul trapped, a spirit in agony. This wasn't my end. It was hers, and I could help her. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing myself to meet her gaze. I'm not afraid of you, I whispered, even though my voice shook. You don't have to hurt me. You don't have to be alone anymore. The figure blinked, and for the first time her twisted grin faltered. The air around me seemed to shift, the whispers in my head softening, turning almost curious. "I can help you," I continued, my voice growing steadier. "But you have to let me." She didn't move, didn't speak. But something in her expression changed. The anger, the malice that had burned behind her eyes faded, replaced by something else, something that almost resembled sorrow. I held my breath, waiting, hoping I had reached her. And then, slowly, she stepped back. The cold grip that had held me in place loosened, and the room, though still dim, no longer felt oppressive. The lights flickered again, but this time they stayed on, casting a soft, pale glow around us. I took a step forward, careful, unsure if the shift in her demeanor was real or just another trick. But as I got closer, I could see the change. The grotesque features that had once twisted her face were smoothing, the hollow darkness in her eyes slowly filling with something warmer, something more human. "I know what you want," I said softly. "You want peace. You've been stuck here for so long and you don't know how to leave." Her eyes flicked toward the door, then back to me. She wasn't hostile anymore, just lost. "The tombstone," I murmured. "It's your anchor, isn't it? The reason you can't move on." A flicker of recognition crossed her face, and I knew I was right. Without another word, I turned and headed for the cemetery. The night was still, the air cold but no longer biting. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the tombstones, but I wasn't afraid. I could feel her presence behind me, but it wasn't threatening anymore. She was following, waiting. When we reached the broken tombstone, I knelt down in front of it, running my fingers over the crack that had grown wider each day. "This is what's keeping you here," I said, glancing over my shoulder at her. She stood a few feet away, her figure faint and flickering in the moonlight, but she was watching me closely. "I'm going to help you," I promised. I wasn't sure what to do, but instinct guided me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, a photo of my grandmother. I had carried it with me ever since she passed, a reminder of her love, her strength. I placed the photo at the base of the tombstone and whispered a quiet prayer, something she had taught me long ago. The ground beneath me shifted, and the crack in the tombstone began to close. Slowly at first, then faster until the stone was whole again, as if it had never been broken. The air around us hummed with energy, and I felt the presence behind me grow stronger. I stood and turned to face her. The figure was no longer twisted, no longer grotesque. She was whole, her face soft, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. The weight of centuries of pain and suffering seemed to lift from her shoulders, and for the first time she smiled, not a twisted, terrifying grin, but a genuine, peaceful smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice no longer the guttural growl that had haunted me for days. It was soft, almost melodic, filled with the warmth of someone who had finally found peace. I smiled back, tears stinging my eyes. "You're free now." And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The cold dissipated, the whispers ceased, and the cemetery was quiet once more. But this time, the silence wasn't threatening. It was peaceful. I stood there for a long time, staring at the now whole tombstone, the weight of the past few days finally lifting from my chest. I had come face to face with the darkness, but I had survived. And somehow, in the process, I had helped someone find their way home. As I turned to leave the cemetery, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that almost felt like a soft goodbye. The tombstone behind me stood tall and whole, my name no longer carved into it. I was free, and so was she. The end.